December 1942. Somewhere above the Solomon Islands, a 19-year-old waist gunner named Eddie Kowalski stood in the belly of a B-17 bomber. His hands gripped a Browning .50 caliber machine gun that shook so hard it felt like a jackhammer. The metal floor beneath him rattled with every burst of turbulence. Then, through the narrow glass window, he saw it, a Japanese Zero fighter cutting across the sky at 300 yards, moving fast from left to right like a dart. Eddie's instincts took over. He aimed directly at the shiny silver plane and squeezed the trigger. A roar filled the bomber. Hot shells clattered to the floor as 50 rounds tore through the air, streaking out in bright red tracers. Eddie watched in disbelief as every single bullet passed harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The enemy plane didn't even react. No evasive move, no panic, just a smooth, confident glide through the chaos. Within seconds, Eddie's ammo counter hit 0. The Zero vanished into the clouds, untouched. This wasn't just Eddie's mistake. It was a problem happening everywhere. American gunners, well-trained, brave, and using the best weapons in the world, were missing their targets again and again. In early 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces ran a detailed study using gun camera footage from hundreds of missions in Europe and the Pacific. The results shocked everyone. The average hit rate against crossing targets was under 4%. That meant 96 out of every 100 bullets missed. The math was brutal. A bomber gunner usually had about 8 to 12 seconds to shoot before the enemy passed out of range. The Browning M2 fired 800 rounds per minute, about 13 rounds a second. So in a 10-second fight, a gunner could fire 130 bullets. With only a 4% hit rate, maybe 5 bullets would actually hit the enemy plane. 5 hits weren't enough to bring down a rugged fighter like a German Focke-Wulf 190 or a Japanese Zero, and while those bullets missed, the enemy fighters didn't. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force in Europe lost an average of 188 bombers every single month. Each bomber carried 10 men. That meant almost 1,100 crew members were killed, captured, or went missing every 30 days. Many of those losses came from bombers that simply couldn't defend themselves effectively. The gunners weren't cowards. They followed their training perfectly, tracking the target, controlling their bursts, staying calm under fire. But the problem wasn't courage. It was physics. And physics didn't care how brave you were. Every gunner did what instinct told him to do, aim directly at the enemy. That's what makes sense. You point at what you want to hit. But that logic falls apart when both you and your target are moving at hundreds of miles per hour. Those Japanese and German fighters weren't stationary. They sliced through the sky at over 300 mph, sometimes faster than 500 in late war models. Even though bullets fired from the Browning traveled at nearly 2,900 feet per second, they still took about a third of a second to reach an enemy plane 300 yards away. In that time, the target moved forward more than 130 feet, about the length of 11 cars. So by the time Eddie's bullets got there, the Zero was long gone. The bullets flew through empty sky. This was called deflection error. It had been understood in theory since before World War II, but understanding a problem and fixing it in combat were two very different things. The correction required wasn't small. At 300 yards, a gunner had to aim 15 to 20 feet ahead of the target, essentially firing into empty air and trusting the plane would fly into the stream of bullets. Every instinct screamed against it. The Army tried teaching this concept in training schools, but it didn't work. At the Laredo Gunnery School in Texas, trainees practiced with mock turrets and towed targets. They learned to calculate angles and lead. But when they faced real combat, their brains froze. Every situation was different. Target speed, distance, angle, altitude, direction, whether it was climbing or diving. And all that had to be processed in about 4 seconds while your own bomber was being shot at. Even when gunners tried to lead the target, they often second-guessed themselves. They'd fire a burst ahead of the plane, see the tracers miss in front, then move their aim back toward the enemy. Exactly the wrong correction. Gun camera footage from 1943 shows this over and over. First bursts led too far, later bursts too little, until they were shooting right at the plane and missing again. The result was tragic. In October 1943, the bombing raid on Schweinfurt, Germany, cost 60 bombers out of 291. Over 600 airmen were lost in a single day. Survivors came back with shattered hydraulics, holes in their wings, engines smoking. Many gunners said the same thing in their debriefs. They'd fired everything they had, but nothing hit. Something had to change. If things stayed the same, the Allied bombing campaign would collapse before it even reached Berlin. Somewhere, Someone needed to find a way to teach humans to fight physics and win. That answer had actually existed since 1924, sitting forgotten in a dusty file. It came from an American artillery officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle. Years earlier, he'd written a technical paper called The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. In it, he warned that as aircraft got faster, human instinct would become useless. He calculated that at 250 mep, a gunner needed to aim 4 to 5 plane lengths ahead of the target. Without some kind of mechanical help, he said, air gunners would be practically helpless within a decade. Nobody listened. The Army filed the paper away and moved on. When World War II began, gunnery training was still based on old rifle range habits: aim, steady, fire. Trainees fired at slow-moving targets and left thinking they were ready. But when they met real enemy fighters moving like lightning, all that training meant nothing. By mid-1942, commanders were desperate. Losses were climbing, morale was falling, and no one knew how to fix it. Until a young captain digging through archives at Wright Field found Puckle's paper and realized that everything happening in the skies was exactly what one man had predicted 18 years earlier. Captain Robert. Travis was a quiet man who believed in solving problems with logic, not luck. When he found Lieutenant Colonel Puckle's forgotten paper in an old cabinet at Wright Field, he didn't just see numbers. He saw the reason thousands of gunners were dying. Travis realized that human reaction time and instinct couldn't keep up with the speed of modern air combat. But maybe machines could help. He shared the paper with his commanding officer, Colonel Frank Armstrong, who was leading the Army Air Force's Gunnery Improvement Program. Armstrong read the report twice, then said something that would change history. "We don't need better men. We need to show them what they can't see." The problem was visualization. Gunners couldn't imagine where their bullets would be half a second in the future. They were reacting to what their eyes saw now, not what would happen next. What they needed was a way to see into the future, to know exactly where to fire before the target even got there. So Armstrong and Travis created a new kind of training tool. They called it the Flexible Gunnery Trainer. But the men quickly gave it a more dramatic nickname, the Shootin' Gallery. It worked like this. Instead of using real planes, they built a small enclosed dome where moving images of enemy aircraft were projected onto a curved screen. Inside the dome, a trainee sat behind a real machine gun mount connected to sensors. When he fired, a light beam, like an early laser, projected onto the screen. The system recorded exactly where his shots went. After each round, instructors replayed the footage, showing the gunner how far behind or ahead he'd been. It was revolutionary. For the first time, gunners could actually see their mistakes in real time. They learned that aiming directly at a target almost always meant missing. They practiced leading by specific amounts based on the target's angle and speed. It became muscle memory. The Army built dozens of these trainers at airfields across the U.S., Laredo, Harlingen, Tyndall, and Buckingham. Trainees spent hours inside the domes firing at simulated Zeros, Messerschmitts, and Focke-Wulfs. Within weeks, hit rates during practice jumped from 4% to nearly 30%, but that wasn't enough. Combat wasn't just about aim, it was about chaos. Real gunners had to deal with vibrations, noise, cold, fear, and confusion. In the trainer, everything was calm. In the air, nothing was. So the instructors pushed further. At Buckingham Airfield in Florida, engineers designed a mobile gunnery trainer that used a full-size B-17 fuselage mounted on hydraulic platforms. When the trainee fired, the entire fuselage shook like it was being hit by turbulence or flak. Loudspeakers blasted the sound of engines and gunfire. Lights flashed to simulate explosions. The goal was to make the trainee's brain feel as if he was really in combat, sweating, flinching, struggling to focus. Soon, the gunners who graduated from these schools started arriving in Europe. The difference was immediate. In early 1944, during raids over France and Germany, gun camera analysis showed average hit rates had tripled. Bomber formations that used to lose 1 in 5 aircraft were now returning with only minor damage. One gunner from the 100th Bomb Group, Sergeant Joe Ramirez, later said, "Before the trainer, I used to fire at planes. After it, I fired at where they were going, and that made all the difference." But training was just one side of the solution. The other came from a surprising source, Hollywood. In late 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces invited director Howard Hawks and special effects expert Linwood Dunn to visit the training centers. They wanted to make a short instructional film to explain the concept of deflection shooting in simple visual terms. Hawks brought in actor and pilot Jimmy Stewart, who had joined the Air Force himself, to narrate and demonstrate the idea. The film, titled The Gunnery Problem, used animation, slow motion, and real combat footage to show how lead worked. It explained that you must always aim ahead of the target, not at it. The movie was shown in every air gunnery school in America, and it changed how thousands of men thought about shooting. Still, even with better training, gunners faced impossible odds. In a single mission, a B-17 could be attacked by more than 50 enemy fighters. Each gunner had to track multiple targets moving in different directions, all while the bomber was shaking and diving. The human brain could only process so much. That's when another innovation arrived: the computing gun sight. Developed by the Sperry Corporation, this new sight used gyroscopes to calculate how fast the gun and target were moving relative to each other. When a gunner tracked an enemy plane, through the sight, the gyros automatically adjusted the reticle to show exactly where to fire. In other words, the sight led the target for him. It wasn't perfect, it required calibration and steady hands, but it gave even average gunners a fighting chance. Paired with the new training, it made a deadly combination. By mid-1944, Allied bomber crews were shooting down enemy fighters at record rates. German and Japanese pilots began to notice that American gunners were no longer missing. Attacks that once seemed easy turned suicidal. Luftwaffe losses skyrocketed. In just 6 months, the balance of air power shifted. The U.S. didn't just have more planes. It had smarter, better trained, scientifically prepared crews. Every gunner who climbed into a bomber now carried the lessons of physics, training, and innovation in his mind. Back home, Colonel Armstrong looked at the data with pride. The average life expectancy of a bomber crew on European missions had nearly doubled. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of young Americans were alive because someone had finally listened to an old report and turned it into action. But the story didn't end there. As the war went on, another question emerged. If human instincts were such a weakness in air combat, could machines one day do the job better? Could computers replace gunners entirely? By 1945, scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory were already experimenting with the answer. And what they discovered would set the stage for a technology that changed not just warfare, but the entire modern world. It was 1945, and the war in Europe was entering its final violent months. But inside a quiet laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, something far more futuristic was happening. While the skies above Germany were filled with bombers and fighters, in a basement full of chalkboards and wires, a group of young scientists were trying to build a machine that could think faster than any human gunner ever could. The project was led by a mathematician named Norbert Wiener. He was brilliant, eccentric, and always surrounded by piles of equations that only he seemed to understand. Wiener had studied the same problem that air gunners faced: how to hit something that's moving while you're also moving. He realized that it wasn't just a problem of skill, it was a problem of prediction. Every time a gunner fired, he was trying to guess where the target would be a fraction of a second later. Wiener wondered, could a machine make that prediction automatically? Could a device watch the motion of an enemy aircraft, calculate its path, and tell the gunner where to shoot, all in real time? He called it the anti-aircraft predictor. Today, we would call it an early form of an artificial intelligence. Wiener worked with engineers from Sperry and the Army's Ordnance Department. They used radar data and mathematical formulas to build a system that could calculate future positions of moving targets. Every few milliseconds, the predictor adjusted its output based on new information, learning and correcting itself. This process, feedback control, was revolutionary. It meant the machine didn't just follow instructions, it responded to reality. To test it, they hooked the device to a mock anti-aircraft gun and fed it simulated radar data from enemy planes. The machine moved the gun automatically, predicting where the target would be before it arrived. To everyone's surprise, the computer hit almost every time. Wiener had done something extraordinary. He had taught a machine to think like a gunner, but faster, calmer, and more accurately. He called the new science cybernetics, from the Greek word kybernetes, meaning steersman. It was the study of how humans and machines could work together using feedback loops, how information could control behavior. Cybernetics would go on to inspire everything from guided missiles to self-driving cars, but at that moment, it was simply a way to save pilots' lives. Meanwhile, out in the Pacific, American air crews were facing the most dangerous missions of the war. Japanese kamikaze pilots were diving straight into ships and bombers with suicidal precision. Traditional defensive shooting didn't work. By the time gunners saw the attackers, it was already too late. But now, thanks to the advances in gunnery science, the U.S. Navy and Air Force had a new edge. Ships were equipped with radar-guided fire control systems based on Wiener's feedback models. The guns tracked and fired automatically, predicting the kamikaze's path before human eyes could even follow it. During the Battle of Okinawa, these systems saved countless lives. One naval officer wrote, "The new predictors are faster than the human mind. They're saving ships that would have been lost 6 months ago." At the same time, bomber units over Japan were using the latest computing gun sights, an improved version of the Sperry design called the K-14. It used gyroscopes, moving mirrors, and electronic relays to calculate lead angles instantly. When a P-51 Mustang pilot locked onto an enemy Zero, the sight automatically adjusted his aim. All the pilot had to do was keep the target centered. The rest was math and machinery. For the first time, the machine and the man were fighting as one. Back in the States, the success of these technologies caught the attention of the government's top scientists. What if, they wondered, this new science of prediction could be used for more than shooting down planes? Could it help guide rockets, control ships, even manage entire systems of machines? In 1946, after the war ended, the U.S. military invited Wiener and his team to continue their research. They wanted to use his cybernetic feedback systems for the next generation of weapons, missiles, radar-guided bombs, and even early computers that could think strategically. But Wiener saw a bigger picture. He realized that the same principles could apply to biology, communication, and even human society. He wrote a book called Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. It became one of the most influential works of the 20th century. Still, while scientists dreamed of a peaceful future, the soldiers who had survived the air war were simply trying to go home. Sergeant Joe Ramirez, the gunner who once said he learned to fire at where the enemy was going, was one of them. He returned to Texas in late 1945, his bomber riddled with holes but still flying. When he visited the Laredo Gunnery School, the same place where he'd trained years earlier, he saw the next generation of gunners practicing with the latest trainers. Everything was faster, smarter, and more scientific. He smiled and said to an instructor, "You guys won't need men like me anymore. The machines are getting too smart." The instructor laughed, but in his eyes there was a hint of truth. The war had proven that machines could see patterns humans missed, react faster than nerves, and survive longer than flesh. The world was entering a new age, one born not in peace, but in necessity. The science that saved thousands of bombers was about to give birth to something much bigger: computers, automation, and the idea that information itself could be a weapon. In the final days of the war, as Allied bombers flew their last missions over Tokyo, the Army quietly began funding a secret post-war research project, Project RAND. Its goal, to study how human decision-making could be replaced or supported by machines. RAND would later become the birthplace of computer modeling, artificial intelligence, and the early internet. All of it began with the same question Eddie Kowalski faced 3 years earlier in his B-17. How do you hit something that's moving? Now that question had evolved. Scientists were no longer asking how to shoot better. They were asking how to think better, faster, and more precisely than ever before. By the summer of 1945, the war was ending, but the race to master information had just begun. In a few years, the same mathematical formulas that guided bullets would guide rockets, first across the Atlantic, then into space. And just as one forgotten paper from 1924 had changed air warfare forever, the discoveries made in those quiet MIT labs were about to change the entire world. August 6, 1945. A silver B-29 bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island, carrying the first atomic bomb ever used in war. Inside, the crew worked calmly through their checklists. Every gauge, every instrument, every gun turret was the result of years of innovation. The same chain of ideas that had started with the gunners who learned to lead their targets in the skies over Europe. As the bomb bay doors opened high above Hiroshima, one thing was clear. The war that began with bullets and steel was ending with mathematics and machines. After World War II, America's scientists and soldiers returned home as heroes, but they didn't leave their discoveries behind. What they had learned about prediction, automation, and feedback control was too powerful to forget. The technologies created to help gunners survive were now being turned toward a new purpose: building the future. At MIT, Norbert Wiener continued to develop his theories of cybernetics. He believed that everything, machines, animals, even societies, could be understood through feedback, a process of action, measurement, and correction. In his words, "We are only as accurate as the information we receive and the decisions we make." In 1948, Wiener's work inspired a young engineer named Claude Shannon. Shannon took Wiener's ideas and created something entirely new: information theory. He proved that information itself could be measured, stored, and transmitted just like energy. His equations would later become the foundation for computers, digital communication, and the Internet. At the same time, other scientists were adapting wartime gun control systems into peaceful technology. The gyroscopes from computing gun sights became part of early autopilot systems in commercial airplanes. Radar-based fire control systems evolved into air traffic control and weather tracking. Even the simulated shooting galleries from gunnery schools became the ancestors of modern flight, simulators and video games. The same mathematics that helped a bomber gunner survive a dogfight was now teaching pilots how to land safely in fog. But not all of these lessons stayed peaceful. During the Cold War, the U.S. military built automated radar networks designed to detect incoming nuclear bombers. They were powered by feedback control and real-time computation, the direct descendants of Wiener's wartime predictor. Engineers at Rand and Bell Labs began creating the first digital computers capable of processing thousands of calculations per second. One of these systems, SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, could track hundreds of aircraft at once and guide interceptors automatically. SAGE became the largest computer network ever built at the time, and it laid the groundwork for something that would one day connect the entire planet: the Internet. By the 1950s, former airmen who had once struggled to hit a single enemy plane were now working as engineers, radar operators, and programmers. They helped design the first guided missiles, which used onboard sensors and feedback circuits to steer themselves, essentially flying versions of the smart gun sights they had once used by hand. One of those engineers, a former B-24 gunner named Harold Beckett, later said, "We didn't know it at the time, but every bullet we missed taught us something." Every mistake in the sky became a formula on the ground. The world was moving fast, faster than any fighter plane. And just like the gunners of 1943, humanity now faced a new kind of target. Not an enemy aircraft, but the unknown future itself. Norbert Wiener saw this coming. In his later years, he warned that machines might one day outthink their creators. "The more we automate," he wrote, "the more we must learn what it means to be human." His warning went mostly unheard. The Cold War demanded progress, not reflection. Computers got smaller, faster, and more powerful. By the 1960s, early artificial intelligence programs were already making decisions, predicting patterns, and even learning from data, the same feedback loop Wiener had built for his gun predictor 2 decades earlier. The age of cybernetics had arrived, yet deep inside the archives of the Air Force, that original report from 1924, the one by Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, still sits quietly. A single dusty file typed on yellow paper, predicting everything that would follow, that as machines and aircraft grew faster, human instinct would fall behind unless we taught it to adapt. He had been right. From Eddie Kowalski's shaking hands on a B-17 turret to the digital targeting systems of modern jets, Every improvement was a step in the same journey, a journey to close the gap between human reaction and mechanical precision. Today, fighter jets lock onto targets automatically. Ships defend themselves with radar-guided guns that fire faster than any man could react. Satellites use predictive algorithms to track objects thousands of miles away. All of it, every computer, every automated defense system, can trace its ancestry. Back to that moment in 1943 when a young gunner missed. A zero because he didn't lead far enough. Ahead, that single miss revealed a truth about humanity. No matter how brave or skilled we are, instinct alone isn't enough in a world that moves this fast. We need tools, machines, and knowledge to see beyond what's right in front of us. The war taught us that survival depends not only on strength, but on understanding. As the veterans of that air war grew old, their children and grandchildren entered a world shaped by the very science their fathers had helped create. They carried computers in their pockets, played flight simulators for fun, and trusted automated systems to guide airplanes, cars, and even weapons. Most never knew that the roots of all this technology stretched back to the dark skies of World War II. But if you look closely at every digital display, every targeting system, every radar sweep, you can still see traces of those men and the lessons they learned under fire. It all began with one simple, impossible question asked by a frightened 19-year-old in the belly of a bomber. Why can't I hit that plane? The answer would change the course of history.